Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 21. Pit props and parliaments. In the 161st year of the Common Reckoning, the dwarvish brothers Bardi and Harrick were inspecting a recently opened working in a mine in the cliffs overlooking Silvermere, when a pit prop failed. They were both instantly crushed to death by several tons of falling rock. Now, the death of two dwarves in a mining accident may be unfortunate, but it would not usually be remarkable. Mining is dangerous, and fatalities were commonplace. But Bardi was the mine lord, and Harrick was the supervisor of all the Silvermere mines, and their death had extensive repercussions, for Bardi was not only the mine lord, he also operated the mines in the Dark Hills, and his wife, Ingildrifa, was the Lady of Unnascrag, which made him the Earl of that territory. Bardi and Ingildrifa had two children. The elder was a son named Bardulf. He married young, tying the knot with his childhood sweetheart, Asgerd, who was famous for her golden hair, which she wore in an ornate plait. Asgerd became a mother at the tender age of 16 when she gave birth to a son, Bina, and then at the age of 19 she became a widow. Bardulf had a she-hound named Gerda, his favourite hunting dog. The quality that had endeared Gerda to Bardulf was her ferocity, and it was when demonstrating this to one of his companions that Bardulf got bitten. The bite became infected, and Bardulf died a slow and lingering death. Ingildrifa was distraught. She had Gerda arrested and put on trial for murder. Perhaps not surprisingly, the dog was unresponsive to questioning and proved unable to mount a coherent defence. The court pronounced a guilty verdict, and Gerda was executed. Ingildrifa took Asgerd and Bina under her protection. They dwelt with her at Unnascrag, and she made sure that they wanted for nothing. She named Bina as her heir. When Bardi died, Bina was a youth of 16. At that age, his father had been married. Bina showed no signs of doing likewise. Indeed, he was something of a gadabout, but he was good-natured and well-liked. Bardi and Ingildrifa's second child was a daughter, named Ingelfrid. She was her father's favourite. She married an industrious dwarf named Gudrick. Bardi delegated the oversight of the mines in the Dark Hills to Gudrick, and found him to be reliable, trustworthy, and efficient. Gudrick impressed Bardi to such an extent that he became one of the very few people that Bardi would ever ask for advice. Bardi was a well-organised dwarf, and he had kept his will up to date. He bequeathed the mines at Silvermere to Ingelfrid, who thus became the mine lady. He confirmed that Bina would in time inherit the earldom of Unnascrag. Having thus provided for the future financial security of both his son's son and his own daughter, he bequeathed the contract to operate the mines in the Dark Hills to Gudrick. And it was this last clause that caused all the trouble. Now Bardi had operated the mines in the Dark Hills under a charter issued by Ulfgrim, who was the king of those parts. This charter granted control of the mines to Bardi and his heirs in exchange for an annual fee to be paid to the crown. This arrangement suited Ulfgrim, who was quite happy to live in idle luxury at the Hillhold, drawing an ample income from the mines without actually having to do anything. Ulfgrim's eldest son was named Ulfkill. He was now in his mid-30s and becoming increasingly impatient with his father's indolence. He brooded on the time only 30 years previously, when Queen Asta had ruled the Dark Hills. Ulfgrim might sit on her throne, but she had ruled over territories far wider than those that Ulfgrim now controlled. Ulfkill dreamed of reconquering those territories and restoring the lost glory of those days, with himself at the centre of it all. But that would require spear dwarves, and spear dwarves had to be paid. Ulfkill looked at the mines in the Dark Hills, and he saw a source of income that was being underutilised. Not only was Bardi earning substantial profits that would otherwise have come to the crown, but he tightly managed production at the mines, only selling to craftsmen who adhered to the standards of manufacture and business practices set by the Council of Guildsmen in South Vale. After all, Bardi did not want the mines in the Dark Hills to compete with those at Silvermere and put the latter out of business. The only other dwarvish mines were a few independent operations around Unners Crag, but Ingildrifa made sure that they didn't step out of line. Bardi had a monopoly, and he exploited it. But Ulfkill didn't care about the profits of the mines in Silvermere or Unners Crag. He just saw that if he was in control of the mines in the Dark Hills, he could significantly step up production, undersell his competitors, and make a lot of money, which he could use to finance his long-envisioned military ventures. He had occasionally raised this matter with Ulfgrim, but Ulfgrim had always insisted that the contract with Bardi could not be broken. Bardi's death changed all that. After all, Ulfgrim's charter had granted control of the mines to Bardi and his heirs. To Ulfkill, this required that the right to operate the mines should pass down the main line of descent, and thus to Bina. And so, by bequeathing it to Gudric, Bardi had breached the terms of the charter, which was therefore null and void. Ulfgrim should take back control of the mines and allow Ulfkill to manage them for him. Ulfgrim liked a quiet life, and Ulfkill was persistent in this argument. Eventually Ulfgrim gave way. Ulfkill turned up at the mines with a band of spear dwarves. Gudric was escorted to the northern border at Spear Point, and Ulfkill installed himself in Gudric's place. An indignant Gudric headed back to Silvermere, where he initially attempted to mount a legal challenge to the termination of the charter, and force Ulfgrim to reinstate him as manager of the mines in the Dark Hills. Although the Council of Guildsmen found in Gudric's favour, it very rapidly became evident that its ability to enforce its rulings did not extend as far as the Hillhold. Gudric then decided to use brute force to get his own way. After all, his wife Ingolfrid was the mine lady. She already employed a number of spear dwarves, and there were plenty of funds to hire more. Gudric entered into communication with his mother-in-law, Ingildrifa, intending to assemble an army at Unners Crag and march upon the Hillhold, as Bardi had done before him. The key difference was that he would be making war on Ulfgrim, rather than coming to his defence. But Gudric now discovered that Ingildrifa had her own agenda. She informed Gudric that she was happy to allow him to use Unners Crag as a base from which to make war on Ulfgrim. Indeed, she went further, offering to supplement his forces with her own. But there were two conditions. The first condition was that she should be placed in overall command of the combined army. After all, as she pointed out to Gudric, she had experience of military command, and he did not. Now, it is possible that Gudric might have swallowed his pride and accepted this. But then Ingildrifa informed him that she agreed with Ulfkill's legal analysis. In her view, the person who should have control of the mines was Bina. It was he who had been cheated out of his inheritance, not Gudrick. And she would only support making war on the dwarves of the Dark Hills if that war was waged in order to right this wrong by wresting the mines from Ulfkill and putting them under Bynar's control. This second condition was completely unacceptable to Gudrick, so he looked to find an alternative base of operations. If he could not attack the Dark Hills from the southwest, from Unnar's Crag, maybe he could attack them from the north, from the Geitsmark. After all, the enmity between Geitsbin and the Hillhold was long established and deep-seated. But once again, Gudrick's plans were frustrated, for Ulfkill had wasted no time putting his ideas into operation. He had flooded the market with relatively inexpensive metal, and he was not fussy about who he sold it to. In the Dark Hills, the dwarvish workshops were working long hours, producing significant quantities of goods, which the merchants of Geitsbin were eagerly purchasing and transporting over Bensby Bridge, selling them in the Halfling lands. Money was being made hand over fist, and significant import and export duties were flowing into the royal treasury of the Geitsmark. The king of the Geitsmark at this time was Halfred, the son of Harni. Halfred was no friend of the Hillhold. Harni had been killed making war upon Ulfgrim, but neither was Halfred a friend of Bardi or his relatives. The arrow that had killed Harni had been loosed by a halfling archer in Bardi's employ. Halfred bluntly rejected Gudrick's overtures. For now he was content to fill his coffers. Maybe war would come later, but in that case, if anyone was going to take over the mines in the Dark Hills, Halfred reckoned it might as well be him. After all, in doing so, he would be concluding his father's unfinished business. Gudrick had run out of options other than gritting his teeth and making the best of a bad job. Ingelfrid installed him as supervisor of the Silvermere mines, but despite Gudrick's undoubted talents in this area, each year that passed saw reductions in both production volumes and profit margins. By the 164th year of the Common Reckoning, Ulfkill had accumulated a significant war chest and was keen to turn his dreams of empire into a reality. He started to raise an army with the first objective of re-establishing the sovereignty of the Hillhold over the Eastland, that is to say, the dwarvish territories to the east of the river Ravenshead. The Eastlanders had paid taxes to Asta, but not to Ulfgrim. Ulfkill intended to change that. He also expected to encounter very little in the way of coordinated resistance. This was frontier territory, and the inhabitants were notoriously independently minded, unsociable, and hence disorganized. Or had been, for things had moved on since Asta's day. The frontier was now to the east of the Great River. Over there, things were still chaotic. But the area between the river Ravenshead and the Great River had been settled for a generation, and although there was no centralised government, some structures of local government had emerged, primarily to enforce law and order. There was plenty of contact between the dwarves in the Dark Hills and those living in the Eastland. The news that Ulfkill was assembling an army, and rumours as to what he intended to do with it, soon crossed the river Ravenshead, and the Eastlanders were not happy about it. There was an Eastlander named Scalfin, a well-to-do farmer, renowned for his honesty and plain speaking. His high standing was enhanced by the fact that his wife Freydis was descended from Boddi, who had, in his time, ruled over both Unnar's Crag and the Dark Hills. Scalfin spread the word across the Eastland that a parliament was to be gathered to discuss the gathering threat of invasion, and how best to meet it. He invited each community to send a representative to that assembly, and they did so. There was much dispute at that first Parliament of the Eastland, but swords remained sheathed, and eventually consensus emerged. Scalfin was elected as the War Earl of the Eastland. He would hold that position for 1 year, leading the Eastlanders in their fight against Ulfkill. For that purpose, each of the communities of the Eastland would provide him with an agreed number of fighting dwarves, to be mustered at a time of Scalfin's choosing. Scalfin's first act as War Earl was to send a messenger north to Silvermere, proposing to Guderic that he march an army of spear dwarves over the high passes between Lordsgrave and Maidesbarrow, down into the Eastland, to join forces with Scalfin and launch a preemptive strike into the Dark Hills, with the intention of taking control of the mines and thus bringing Ulfkill to terms. These terms would include the Hillhold relinquishing any claim to sovereignty over the Eastland and passing control of the mines back to Guderic. Now, the path over the mountains was not an easy one, but it did offer Guderic what he wanted more than anything else, a base from which to attack Ulfkill. Guderic accepted Scalfin's proposal, and he moved quickly. Within a week of receiving Skalgrim's proposal, he had assembled a force of spear dwarves. A week after that, he was marching it up into the mountains. Although it was summer, the mountain passes were still thickly covered with snow, but the weather was kind and held fair. Despite several cases of snow blindness and frostbite, Guderic and his spear dwarves were in the Eastland within a few days, where they joined forces with Scalfin and his newly mustered levies. A week later, the combined army crossed the River Ravenshead and marched into the Dark Hills. Ulfkill had not expected this bold move. He had intended to be the aggressor, but his preparations for war were largely complete when news of Scalfin's incursion reached him. He hastily put his assembled troops into battle order and marched them out to meet their foes. The two forces met at Firfell. Ulfkill won the victory, and Guderic lost his life. Scalfin and the tattered remnants of his hastily levied army reeled back over the River Ravenshead in disarray. Ulfkill did not rush headlong after them. He allowed time for the dead to be honoured, the wounded treated, and his troops rested. Only then did he march his army into the Eastland. The Eastlanders feared the worst, that a vengeful Ulfkill would harry the land with sword and fire, seeking retribution for their attack upon him. But Ulfkill desisted from such behaviour. Once his army had crossed the River Ravenshead, he set up camp on the east bank, issued and enforced orders prohibiting any plundering of the locals, and sent envoys to the Eastlanders, demanding that they recognise him as their liege, pay to him the taxes that they had previously paid to Asta, and sent to him Scalfin's head, either attached to his living body or otherwise. These were the circumstances in which the second Parliament of the Eastland was convened. Its proceedings were concluded within a single day. Ulfkill's terms were accepted in full. Accepted in full, but not fully delivered, for Scalfin could clearly see which way the tide was turning. Even as the Parliament commenced its brief deliberations, he and his family were fleeing, seeking sanctuary at Unnascrag. Ulfkill was master of the Eastland, but, for the moment at least, Scalfin remained master of his own head, although of little else.